Good morning. God is good all the time. I want to clear up any misconceptions before we start. I'm not running for political office or campaigning this morning. I'm sure if you've been watching the presidential campaigns, or you're familiar with the Navy suit and the red tie. So I want to clear that up before we start. If you would turn back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12, our scripture reading that Luke read for us earlier. It's really good to be with you all this morning and spend time here to worship you. And for all the young guys who have led in services so far, I really appreciate, or will later, I really appreciate the effort and time you put into your part and the courage it takes to get up here in front of everybody and to participate in that. And the new song that Evan just led us in, 10,000 Reasons, is one of my personal favorites. And I really appreciate, or I really encourage you to learn that song as a very powerful and uplifting one. If you would turn back to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Whenever Joe and Dempsey asked me about talking this morning, they told me that as far as the topic to discuss the story of Joseph from the viewpoint of a young man. And as I spent time considering Joseph's life, obviously within the context of my own perspective as a young man and that of the lesson, my mind was just kind of drawn to this verse and this idea of remembering God in the days of your youth. In many ways, I think that this verse was the key to Joseph's success. It is abundantly clear as we go through Joseph's story that Joseph kept God first at all times of his life. Well, I think this verse is a great reminder and charge to young people such as myself. I don't think that this verse even needs to include the part about youth. It could just simply say, remember your Creator in your days. And I really like the way this chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes ends. If we would skip down to verse 13, chapter 12. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. I say all this because the story of the life of Joseph is so much more than a story we learn as kids in Bible class on Sunday morning or a study for young men, but is one that's very applicable and helpful to us all. Joseph is one of the greatest individuals that we have an account of in the Old Testament. His character, his situation, the things mentioned about him are just unbelievable to me. And when you take into account that he's a young man, it is even more impressive, a young man who has not been treated well. The story of Joseph is for everyone. It is for those from the elementary and middle school to the nursing home, from the new Christian to the more experienced, or whatever two extremes you want to come up with. The act of remembering your Creator at any time in your life isn't something that will magically happen one day and you start living your life different, but requires intentionality on our part. It is a day-by-day effort. And as we go through this study today, I want you to keep this concept in mind of remembering your Creator one day at a time or day by day. I also want to go ahead and make mention that that Joseph's life is packed full of so many different lessons and applications, far more than I could ever fit into one sermon this morning. What I've prepared today is just a small fraction of Joseph's story and the lessons from it. So I really encourage you to take some time this week, consider for yourself Joseph's life, what you see in his story, how that might apply to your life, and how you might improve your spiritual life. With that being said, let's get into the life of Joseph. We were first introduced to Joseph in Genesis chapter 37. He is the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons. He's very quickly identified as being his father's favorite despite his age rank. So right off the bat, we find Joseph's brothers having a sense of jealousy and envy towards him due to their father's favoritism. And this feeling will only grow in the following verses, and it grows to the point of hatred, as Joseph relays two different dreams he had in which his brothers bow down and exalt him. In time, Jacob decides to send Joseph to check on his brothers in the flock and to visit with them and to report back about the brothers' well-being as well as the flocks. As Joseph approaches the brothers, they see their opportunity, and once he arrives, they throw him in a pit with the intention to kill him. But in a moment of great morality, instead of deciding to kill their little brother, they decide to sell him into slavery. Upon the seeing a passing caravan of Ishmaelite traders. At just the young age of 17, Joseph is sold into slavery by his jealous and envying brothers, where he's taken to Egypt to spend the rest of his life. Now, I might be making an assumption here, but I'd be very surprised if Joseph woke up that morning thinking his brothers would throw him in a pit, intend to kill him, and settle on selling him into slavery. From what we can tell, Joseph lived a good life in Canaan. He came from a wealthy family, had a father who loved him, but just a few moments his life changed significantly. This event changed his life in a very harsh and quick way and started a series of changes that he could never have anticipated. Though he didn't know it at the time, he was actually being introduced to his destiny and the fulfillment of his dreams. We know the whole story of Joseph. We can sit down and we can read the 13 chapters dedicated to his life in Genesis. We know how it ends. But just considering for a moment what Joseph might have been thinking at the bottom of that dark and lonely pit, I think the very last thing he could have seen without God revealing it to him was a future, let alone one where these dreams would be fulfilled. There's really just one point I want to make here in this first section, and it's this idea of being in the pit. I'm sure it's easy for you to recall some time you felt like you were in the pit, a time when things weren't going good in your life, maybe even to the point they're going horrible. Needless to say, we've all been in the pit on some level. And I think we find ourselves wondering, is God punishing me? We might often assume yes, wonder like what we have done wrong or why God might be doing this. But in the context of Joseph's story, we know just the opposite is happening. There is no displeasure towards Joseph by God, but Joseph is being used for God's purpose. We have the ability to know that what is happening to Joseph on this bad day was actually God working in his life. I mean, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a summary or a manual of what to expect when we are in the pit or going through hard times? But there's no indication that Joseph got that luxury. And I think this goes back to another idea we often subscribe to, and that's the idea that all good things come from God and all bad things come from the devil. But if we continue to read Joseph's story, it gets worse. Joseph is bought by Potiphar upon arriving in Egypt, the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard, where he enters his service being a model of integrity and honesty. Joseph quickly gains Potiphar's trust, as the fact that God is with Joseph is abundantly clear through his successes. Potiphar goes on to set Joseph as the overseer of his house, and Joseph continues to succeed. In time, Potiphar's wife attempts to make a proposition with Joseph that he will refuse and subsequently will avoid her to the best of his abilities and his situation. Through a false accusation made by Potiphar's wife, Joseph will be imprisoned. Innocent, just, upright. You can add all the words you want to it, but Joseph is still falsely imprisoned and loses most of the years of his youth as he is imprisoned for up to 10 years. A prisoner in a foreign country with no recourse for having your case resolved, this is the life of Joseph for a very long time. I want to take a moment here to consider this temptation that Joseph faced in Potiphar's wife and how he handled it. First and foremost, I want to point out that Joseph understands that sin is against God. Let's take a look here at Genesis chapter 39, verse 9. There is no one greater in this house than I, that is Joseph, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God? The key to Joseph's rejection of the temptation as presented by Potiphar's wife is that he understands who he is wronging and what sin is, a separation between an individual and God. When we are not obedient to God, we are sinning against him. No sin is just a little sin. Sin is sin, period. Now let's move down to same chapter, verse 10 of chapter 39. As she spoke, that is Potiphar's wife, to Joseph, day after day, he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. I want to point out the repetition of this temptation that is presented by Potiphar's wife. This wasn't a one-off thing or a time or just a certain instance. The text says that she came to Joseph daily, day after day, which I think makes Joseph's response even more impressive in a declaration of his fortitude, day by day. Something that I find myself often forgetful of is the fact that we are constantly, every day, in a spiritual battle. There's not a day that passes that we're not free from temptation or that Satan is not trying to reach us. If you would, consider 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. This passage doesn't say, oh, only watch out for the devil or for temptations on the weekends or while you're at work or certain times of the day. But it says he's seeking each one of us regardless of when. I know something that I personally need to keep more in the forefront of my mind and be more aware of. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. One commentator I listened to in preparation for this talk made the statement that as he read through Joseph's story that Joseph's fortitude and character screams at me. And thinking on this quote, I found it very relatable. And I think that I might take it a step further and say that as I read through Joseph's story, a hand reaches out from the text and just smacks me in the face. Joseph's last day in prison came like any other day when he was told to present himself before Pharaoh. Through God enabling Joseph to interpret the two dreams of the Pharaoh's officials in his time in jail, he has the opportunity to interpret Pharaoh's dreams himself. As a result, is given second in command over all of Egypt, subject to only Pharaoh. Joseph is elevated as a prisoner and a slave from the pit to second in command. How much of a bigger leap can you get going from a slave to the second in command of the most powerful country in that part of the world at that time, all at just 30 years old? This is an incredibly dramatic change. Joseph will go on and be the key figure leading Egypt through the 7 years of surplus, following the 7 years of drought and famine, where he's eventually reunited with his family as they will make the move to Egypt. I think one of the most incredible parts about Joseph's story is his attitude through the entire ordeal that lasts 13 years. I think Joseph expresses this in primarily two different ways. The first is Joseph always gives credit to God, whether he's in the pit or reigning over Egypt. And I think there are challenges and temptation to not give God the credit in both these situations. Not to say that it is right, but I think it'd be very understandable to be frustrated, discouraged, maybe even angry, all types of feelings after enduring what Joseph did. And maybe on some level he did feel like this. But what he didn't do is let it interfere with how he conducted himself as a representation of someone who follows God or affect his overall attitude. And I think if we could have some of the prayers that Joseph, with other prayers of the Bible recorded in the Psalms and other parts of the Bible, it would be amazing to see the things that he had to say in his prayers. Our lives are a constant series of ups and downs. I think two of the easiest times for us to abandon God or opt out of our faith is when we're either at the top when we're either at the bottom in the pit or at the top and forget how God got us there. The other primary way I think Joseph expresses his attitude is in what he names his two sons. In Genesis chapter 41, verse 50 through 52, we are told of Joseph's two sons and the meaning of their names. Joseph's firstborn son's name is Manasseh, which means God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second-born son's name is Ephraim. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph chooses to draw near to God in the pit and in the hard times, and also gives God the credit and the praise when he's uplifted and at the top. I also want to point out that Joseph doesn't make excuses for himself to not serve God or to not do what is right through his whole ordeal. We don't see Joseph making statements, and his actions certainly don't reflect phrases like, once I get out of slavery, then I'll start following God and doing what's right. Or after I get back to my family, or after I get out of prison, then I'll be able to really worship God the way he wants me to. There's a laundry list of excuses that Joseph could have come up with to put off doing what was right. But Joseph chose to follow God, and as a result, God used Joseph as an integral part of his plan and uplifted him. These kinds of excuses are not much different than things that I've heard or even thought myself at times. Things like, once I get out of middle school or high school or college, then I'll really commit to doing what's right and doing what God, or I will really commit to doing what's right and following God like I know that I should. Or maybe once I get this new job or this big pay raise, then I'll be able to spend more time telling people about God. Well, I'll have more time to focus on God and my spiritual life. Or something like, whenever I get married or have my first kid, then I'm going to finally put this certain sin out of my life. I know there's more that I could come up with. I'm sure there's more you can come up with yourself, things that you've heard, maybe thought yourself. But these kinds of excuses and ideas are in direct opposition with the way we are commanded to live our lives as Christians, and in direct opposition to the way Joseph lived his. To put it very simply, that is not how it works. That kind of thinking only leads to more procrastination and leads us further away from God into more sin. There's need to take action today. So if you take anything away from today in this sermon, let it be these two things. Joseph chose to have the perspective that he would live for God and do what was right day by day. And second, Joseph's suffering was the means that God was preparing him for a glorious destiny. One last passage from Genesis I want to read is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph is in the process of addressing his brothers following their family's settlement and Jacob's death. Settlement in Egypt and Jacob's death. And he says, As for you, you meant it, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. I want to thank you all for your attention and patience today. Just as a reminder, in a moment we'll sing an invitation song number 813 in your books, Just As I Am. But what's not in your books, but will be on the slides and the screen, is a chorus after the second and third verses. Just as a reminder. There's one more point that I want to make about Joseph, and we'll have our invitation. In so many different ways, Joseph was a type of Jesus. Kevin actually did a full lesson on this not very long ago, so I encourage you to check that out. It's on the website. Joseph led the way for his family to be saved during the drought and eventually grow into the nation that God had promised through his own suffering. In the same way, Jesus came to earth, suffered and died on a cross for our sins, fulfilling a different promise that we might spend eternity with him. One last passage I want you to consider is 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, by his poverty, might become rich. Maybe you're here today, and you haven't been living for God day by day as you ought to, as Joseph did, and you're seeking to get back on track. Maybe you're here and you want to start living for God day by day, start living for Christ day by day as a new creature through baptism. If there's any need, pray that you come now as you stand and sing.